kids, and you can't do this today. It's going to sound strange to youngsters watching this. There was no carpool. There was no soccer moms. You went with your friends and that lived next door to you. Some lived in apartment houses and had 25 friends living in the same building. So Madison High School, with its huge enrollment, you were forced to form a little group together. We formed the Panthers Club. There were 5 of us, inseparable. And that's why I say the big influence. Not only I see him in school all day, but after school, weekends. All you did is eat breakfast in your house, and you left, and your parents expected you back when the street lights got dark. They didn't know where we were. They didn't know what we were doing. I mean, we would go by Subway and go to Coney Island, 13, 14 years old, or go to Ebbets Field. So it was really, my friends had a big influence on me, and I'm going to talk about them in the beginning of this Part 2 tape. And I told you there were 5 of us, all high achievers. When I said we were a club, we were not a gang, we were a club where academics was very important. And all of us not only went to great colleges, we all, for some strange reason, became entrepreneurs, and some very successful. But let me go one by one. And the first one I want to talk about is Alan Van Bergen, who I still see after 65 years or 70 years from school. And in fact, you're going to see him in a few minutes when he talks about a PT boat. I actually had a PT boat as a teenager in Brooklyn. It's a crazy story you're going to see in a minute. And we formed the Panthers became very, very well known because we had sweaters. We played football scheduled in Marine Park where people donated the dollars and quarters when they saw us play. We had fancy uniforms. We were really an organized team. Now, we didn't have enough for a football team, so we actually had to get people to supplement the 5 of us, so we had a whole team. But it was our team. But we were in basketball leagues, and we really were very, very sports-minded, but very, very, very high achievers academically. All got out with really high standing in the class. And everything we did for the 4 years was sort of memorable. And I still see, I had to mention Alan, and not too long ago, I saw another one, a classmate. I worked with him. His name was Eddie Milgram. And another one was called Bernie Lord. When I knew him, he was called Bernie Goldman. He changed his name. And I'm going to go through all the 5 because it's really interesting to show what it was like growing up in the heyday of Brooklyn. The first person that I'm going to talk about is Alan Van Bergen, and we have him here. I interviewed him about a year ago, but before this tape was made, and I still see him. He lives in Long Island, and we communicate, and once in a while we visit. And Alan was a big influence on my life because he was the first one to get drafted. And when he got out of the Army, I got drafted. And he told me what to do, and everything he told me was wrong, and I ended up getting 7 court-martials because of him. But I should have known that, because when we were about 12 years old, we went to the same synagogue, and he talked me into fighting with the rabbi and throwing spitballs at him. Anyway, long story short, both of us got kicked out of Hebrew school, and because of him, I never got bar mitzvahed. But my father wasn't really pushing at that time. And anyway, that's the story. And here's a little interview I took last year with Alan.
Yeah. Does my makeup look okay?
Yeah, I was going to have him make more. Oh, anyway, I just did an audition. I'll show it to you for a commercial. I'm on a commercial.
Oh, really?
TD Ameribank, Meritrade.
Okay.
Well,
yes, I know.
I think I have it. Anyway, what did you remind yourself of the high school?
Well, no, we're skipping high school. I remember you wanted me to ski. You forgot the ski.
Oh, I forgot this story. In fact, I'm getting out of this story. Tell it yourself. What is the story about the skiing?
Skiing. Charlie, I had never skied. And Charlie told me it was great, I should try it. And he took me to some place that was probably the most primitive ski, I wouldn't even call it a resort. I don't know, it was just a hill.
It was Phoenicia, New York.
Phoenicia, is that where it was? And they had a rope tow. And they gave us equipment. I guess we rented equipment.
That was your first day?
First time. Now, the equipment was so primitive that I had boots and skis. Well, the skis would not have come off unless your leg came off. So on my first trip up the rope tow, I slipped on the ice and broke my leg. A serious break. Now, I had just been married, and I was on a new job, and I was in the cast for a couple of months when they were considering surgery, but fortunately they didn't have to.
Well, you ski your own risk.
Right.
Yeah. So but of course his father-in-law was a lawyer.
Right.
So that was a story I forgot. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I taught you how to ski. You got me in trouble in the army. You got me kicked out of the synagogue.
Right.
You know what? I think you weren't a good friend. Now that I remember this, it wasn't a good experience. Anyway, but it was a nice bunch of guys, and that's very important. Your high school peer pressure is very important in life. It sticks with you for the rest of your life, and it was a pleasure meeting you.
Yeah.
I love it.
I wanted, you beat me to it. My last line was going to be that we've been friends for so many years. Charlie has disappeared from my life for years at a time, but then he pops up. I'll find him at my mailbox, or all of a sudden I'll get a phone call. And I don't just like Charlie, I love Charlie. As a matter of fact, I'm still wearing the ankle bracelet he gave me.
Right, and Alan was that interview took place in 2017, and he went to Pratt Institute for art illustration. Very talented artist, really. I mean, he became so successful. He did all the packaging and the illustrations for the packaging for Sears Roebuck, among others. And when he had an opening in his new warehouse that he opened up with all the big lights and the screens, he had a whole bunch of Wilhelmina models there because he used models in some of his packaging. And he really exposed me to what business was like when I was just starting out in my career. And another thing is, I should interject as we go along on my friends. I mean, they weren't all not geniuses. They're very bright, but there are some things I should mention also. Now, most of them had brothers, it seemed. I did too, and my brothers and sisters were so much older. But they had siblings very close in age. And Alan had a brother that wanted to be an actor. And his name is Louis, his real name, and also his theater name is Louis Van Bergen. And here's the scene where he gets the shit kicked out of him by Warren Beatty in the movie Bugsy. Now, Bugsy was the Warren Beatty, with a big movie in 1991. And there's Louis, who was Beatty is looking at, who's Joe Adonis, who was his right-hand man, and all the casinos were owned by the mafia, which Warren Beatty was one of them. So was Joe and Adonis. And this is Louis Van Bergen's biggest part, and this is the biggest ass he ever grabbed in the movie. But look what happens when they find out that it's Warren Beatty's or Bugsy's girlfriend.
Can I speak to you alone?
What do you want? I'm busy.
Well, take a second.
Don't you dare move, dog.
So Beatty calls him over,
You can blink those pretty little eyes.
and this is he never had a part like this again. And so he calls him over, and he wants to talk to him.
All right, look, considering the...
And this is my best friend Alan's kid brother. He's about 4 years younger than us.
You wrote.
And Warren Beatty is very unhappy with him.
What do you do?
Yeah.
Well, why don't you suck your apology out of my dick?
Joey, what a thing to say. Pull it out. Pull it out. You embarrassed? Pull it out. You want me to pull mine out first? Here. Hey, take a look at this.
And now Warren Beatty beats the shit out of him while everybody in the other room isn't even hearing it. And that was Lewis's biggest part, and he was so big, and he got so enamored with himself, he changed agents thinking he's going to be another Clark Gable, and that new agent never did a thing with him, and his career ended. And here's the movie where his career started 15 years before. So Lewis had a 15-year career. There he is. He's a Frenchman. This is the kid from Brooklyn who never finished high school, is talking French with his co-star, Angie Dickinson. And they're on a boat, and he's the captain. And he makes love to her in the plane, in the movie. And that's his first movie. So he was on hundreds of TV shows, too. I mean, he really had a nice career. The other close friend was Bernie Goldman, who was, we were all pretty well-to-do, but he was a millionaire 10 times over. His father was a giant in the garment center in New York. They owned big factories making clothes when the garment center was New York. You know, now it's all disappeared. So Bernie was the richest. He had those, and when we played football, we all had dirty T-shirts. He had custom-made clothes with shoulder pads. I mean, he looked beautiful. He was a lousy football player, but he was the best dressed in the group. And Bernie had a brother, but I didn't know his brother well. I just knew Bernie. And he was already seeing some girl that his mother didn't like. His mother wanted a richer girl. So there was a problem. I mean, he was going to have a 500 people wedding with all the Garment Center friends and so forth, like for $500,000. But he didn't. The family just didn't like her, and he evidently had a fight. And I was home from the army. I was out of the army by this time, and he calls me up at 3:00 in the morning. I'm living in Brooklyn, so is he. We're out of high school, 10 years already. And he says he's getting married. I said, "God damn, it's 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. What are you calling me for?" "I'm eloping. You got to come down to Kings Highway, right across the street from Dubrow's cafeteria on the second floor. There's the rabbi's home. We're getting married." He said, "I'll pay for the cab." So I get dressed at 3 in the morning, and I take a cab, and I find the rabbi's residence, and I go upstairs, and I'm the only witness. And he eloped. And his family, never got over that shock, by the way. Now, Bernie, he went into his own business, and he also went to Cornell to become a mechanical engineer. And I'm just dropping with all the colleges they went to. And he really was a successful entrepreneur. He made equipment for a lot of the aircraft manufacturers. And in South Jersey, he had a big factory, and he sold it for millions and retired at an early age out to Jackson Hole, Wyoming, the famous ski town. And many years later, when we got friendly again, by that time I had 3 kids, and he invited me out there. So I took my kids skiing. His house that he designed and had built was worth about $5 million. It had 12 bedrooms. You can imagine. So each of my kids had their own bedroom. And we went skiing for him for a week. And that was, not many years ago. That was like we were out of school about 60 years, and I still looked him up. And he was on a second marriage. That elopement didn't work out too well. And he had 1 daughter with that first marriage, and he had 3 with the second. So these are the stories. And at the point I'm being, not only are they successful, bright kids, I kept in touch with them all my life. Even though everybody watching this has good friends from high school, but I'm just mentioning it because I always felt they were a little bit more unique. The next one is Eddie Milgram. Now, Eddie is a politician's son. He lived near me, was one of the gang. And his father was the commissioner of the Department of Buildings in New York City. And he got me a job during the summer, and Bernie, an engineer, the 2 engineers. We got surveying jobs during the summer, high paying because of his father, who was very influential. Also, to give you a subject or a topic that you can understand a little better about how powerful he was. In the 40s, when this happened and he got me the job, we were going to college, he gave out the permits for the building permits, so you can build the building. And he inspected, his inspectors, you couldn't do the building without his permit. And what his father did is he put Eddie, my best friend, and his older crooked brother, Artie, who was always a Ganoff, who married the prettiest girl in high school. Anyway, the reason he put them in business, and they became young millionaires because of their dad. In order to get a permit to these big building complexes going up all over New York City because of the returning GIs, there was a big building boom. Every building had a laundromat in the basement. And you had to give Eddie and his brother Artie the rights to the laundromat in the building if you wanted a goddamn permit. So they must have had 2,000 machines. I'm still talking about we're all in the early 20s. And in fact, I used to go out with him to collect the quarters. And there's 2 stories about that. When I saw him again, that was maybe 20 years later, he was even bigger. And he had the largest concession of laundromat in one complex in the United States. It's called Co-op City in the Bronx, which has almost 80,000 people living there with hundreds of machines. And he had the franchise for those buildings because his father got the permit. And then he found a state senator in New York, a state senator in Albany, who became his silent partner. And he gave him the concession in a Mitchell Armor project controlled by the state. So he had the biggest concession. It was so big that he took in quarters maybe $3 million a year, and just in quarters. And when it's just coincidentally, I got hired by the building management to do security because this is a building where all the people from the Bronx who lived on the Bronx Concourse, moved when vandalism became bad in the concourse, and almost all the Jews in the Grand Concourse moved to Co-op City. So therefore, and I'm the consultant, and I heard that he had the concession, and we got friendly again. And he told me a crazy story. To give you an idea what this was like. He said that he had like 7 guys working for him that would collect the quarters, take the bags to the office, which was near Co-op City, and then put it into machines. They dumped the quarters into the machines, and it would count how much. You know, get up to $2-3 million bucks in quarters, a lot. But he got suspicious of one guy, and he had him followed. And then he got pictures of him taking 5 bags out of the co-op and putting them in his trunk and leaving 1 bag at his father-in-law's house, not too far away, and delivering 4 to Eddie. So Eddie one day confronted him. He said, "Harry, I got these photographs. I'm going to turn you over to the district attorney. You've been stealing from me for years. I'm going to have to turn you in, you crooked bastard." And the guy looked at my friend Eddie. He said, "Eddie, you do that, I turn your ass into the IRS because you're under-reporting the goddamn quarters, you crooked bastard." And that was the end of the conversation. And the guy left. There was no prosecution and nothing. Now, Eddie's older brother had other things in mind. His older brother, who was always a gun of crook, had somehow in I'm giving you an idea, 1970, early 70s, New York State started the lottery. But they didn't just go in with a state inspector. They gave out franchises in different parts of the state to individual companies or individuals, and they ran the lotteries. They delivered the tickets to the stores, but they owned it until years later the state took it away. So Artie had the concession for New York City. Somehow, I'm sure it was crooked. In fact, I know it was because I'm going to tell you this story. He after he had the concession, about a year later, the article in the Post shows up that his wife won $50,000 on the lottery, which is kind of crazy. And he explained that it was just luck. But wait, now what you're going to see is a front page story. Artie was in with the mafia with that lottery thing. And they shot him dead in his parking lot of his house in Forest Hills. So that was the 2 stories of brothers. Now that's the now the last one I think I left out is Morty Seaman. Now Morty Seaman had a father who was in the furniture business, and he had one store on Flatbush Avenue called Seaman's. And he sent Morty and his brother, a younger brother, but Morty was the bright one. He sent him to the same school that President Trump went to, the Wharton School of Business at Penn. Now, I told you, Bernie went to Cornell, Morty went to Penn. Out of the 5 of us, we all went to elite schools. And Morty took over Seaman. And so I went, I got married. I didn't see him for a while. But I did see him during college because he'd come up on weekends from Penn. I'd come up from Hoboken, and we would still see each other. So anyway, he took it over, and everybody thinks, well, his father gave him the business. No, his father gave him one store. And he built it up to like a whole chain of Seaman furniture. Some of the older people watching this will remember it. But then he sold it about 35 years ago to a bigger company and got literally $1 billion because it was so big. And he moved down south, and he put his son into the furniture business. Remember, he sold out. There was no more Siemens, had another name, and he gave his son, enough money to open up stores in Florida and Carolinas in the south part, which grew pretty big. And it's called Rooms to Go. Rooms to Go is now the largest chain of furniture stores in America. And that's one of my buddies from high school. Then I had some guy in the class. Of course, I had myself, who became an entrepreneur, who had my own business, designing and installing burglar alarm systems in New York City. And I only did municipal buildings and large public buildings. I never did a private house. And because I found out that if I did a private, I did my home, then I found out my wife was ripping me off. So what good if she had the key to the Dave's alarm system? So anyway, I never did a private house. I'm only kidding about my wife. And the last one is Josh Feinberg, who lived next door to me. And he was really studious. I mean, his parents weren't too wealthy, so he couldn't afford an elite private school, but he got into the public schools, City College, which at that time was one of the best in the country, no tuition. And he graduated #1 in his class. And then He went to and got a scholarship to Harvard Law, opened up a law firm in Boston, and it was one of the biggest firms in Boston when he retired about 8 years ago. So I went through this soliloquy of how successful, but they all influenced, and also I should add, as I pointed out, all of us owned our own business. It's strange, all 5 were entrepreneurs. He's still alive, and he sent me last year a picture which I showed in phase 1 of my graduating class of PS 222 when we were all 13. So everybody I mentioned was in that picture. And Bernie passed away not too long ago, and Eddie Milgram passed away, but I see Alan, and I know Morty's alive in Atlanta. So 3 out of the 5, we're still in healthy conditions. Anyway, that's the story of my upbringing till I got into college. I saw an ad in the New York Post for surplus PT boats, like the ones John Kennedy used. So I showed it to my brother and my father, and my brother went down there and looked at the 3 boats. They had 3 boats for sale, brand new PT boats. They looked something like this. This is a model I made. They were 70 foot long. They went 300 miles an hour. They slept 12 people and had 2 kitchens. And when we bought it, my father bought it, it was $1 million boat. He bought it for $3,500. We had to take the gun turrets off the boat. We had to take the torpedo rack off the back, and the torpedo rack compressor was in the bottom. And then we had to pay, I'd say about $3,000 to put portholes in and put railings on the deck, because the boat went so fast and we had people on it, they could literally fly off the deck. So we had to put railings on it. And we had kept it in Brooklyn. And I was in high school with a daddy who had a PT boat. So I was very popular, and we kept that for about 5 years.
What'd you call the boat?
Kalon 1. And anyway, it was a famous Schnabolk PT boat. Show you what kind of family we had. Alan, as another thought, do you remember the PT boat my family had? And I had it in we bought it in 1947 to 49. We were still in high school. And here's a picture of it. Show it to the people. Remember, you painted it. In order to get a ride, all the gang had to paint on it. You had to paint or you couldn't get a ride.
I remember it vividly because I got deathly seasick.
Oh, you did on the boat?
Oh, I got so sick. I'll never forget it. And then you, of course, were trying to feed me clams or something while I was sick.
But that was a great boat ride. The only PT boat in Brooklyn.
Yeah, it was enormous. Yeah. And I remember the railings cost more than the PT boat.
Yes, yes. The railings cost, the boat cost $3,500. The railings cost about $4,000. Yeah, we bought it surplus.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a nice thing. But the reason I'm asking, except for my nephew Alan, the same name as you, he was about, I would say, 4, 5, 6 years old. He remembers it. You're the only adult alive that has ever been on the boat, beside myself. So it was quite a teenager had a PT boat.
I remember it vividly. It was the only one in the harbor.
And then you helped me take the rowboat I built in the basement.
Which was too big to get out of the basement.
Yeah, and what we do, we had to knock down the side of the door. And then we took it out to the water, and the first day, I put the outboard motor on it. It came off the transom, the boat sank. And then when you painted it once, didn't you do something nasty to me when you were painting it?
We were all painting. The whole group of us were painting, and I was painting the upper deck, and you were on the lower deck, and you leaned your arm on the upper deck while you were doing some chore, and I painted over your arm.
Now remember, this is a military boat that we bought brand new because the war ended and there was still a bunch of boats being built in Annapolis, Maryland, and somebody bought a bunch of them. We bought one, like I told you, for $3,500, $1 million boat, but they're all brand new engines. We had to have the grease taken off. And here you see 2 of them. They're Packard engines with 12-cylinder, 8-inch cylinders, which burns about 300 gallons an hour at full speed, but we used to use just one engine. But I mentioned before it goes 300 miles an hour. No, it's 3,000 gallons. The top speed was about 70 miles an hour. But the point is, we only use one engine at a time, and we bought gas for about 12 cents. So if we filled it up for the summer and put in 200 gallons, it would cost like $50. But down here is the big problem. That's a clutch for each engine, has a clutch like that. And when you to go forward and back and neutral, there's no controls upstairs. It's people holding a light system. And when they want to go forward, they push forward, but the boat don't go forward. It just tells me downstairs the green light for each engine to push it into forward. and then a neutral light to go back. And they were really hard. But when we took it out with my friends from high school and my father, by the way, that's me on the left, and that's a mechanic who was fixing something. These are brand new engines, remember. There's always something going wrong. But the problems with that is that you have to be instant when you see the light, or else the boat could do damage. And of course, when I went on it with my father handling the controls and me and my classmates down in the engine room, we didn't know what was going upstairs till we'd look at the light. And my father was slow in pushing it into neutral light, so we rammed into the boat in front of us and caused $50,000 of damage because it's a big boat. And another time was when we had a lot of parties on the boat, and we're down there and bringing it into the dock, and everybody's drinking up on top. My father, again, he was much older than most pilots of boats this big. He forgot that he put it in neutral, and we docked, and everything was fine. But he forgot that I and my two classmates were handling the engines downstairs, and we're down there sweating, waiting for the next signal. And it was like 20 minutes. We almost died down there from the heat till my father remembered that we were still down in the engine room. So those are just some of the stories of the Schnabolk PT boat in Jamaica Bay, Brooklyn. This is identical to the one we had. It's a PT 728, one of the last ones built, but the war had ended, and they were brand new. Mine, I think ours was called 706. Anyway, this is the four boats in America. Two are in the Rhode Island Museum I mentioned, and one is in New Orleans. And the one in New Orleans, I understand you can actually get rides on it. But this is the only privately owned one, and it came on the market this year. And it's a 57-year-old. It's a 57-year-old. I think it's even longer than that. It is it's about 70 feet. And it's one of the 12 remaining PT boats in the world, and only 4 in the United States. This one is armed. When I bought it, when we bought ours, it was armed, but all the weapons were deactivated, as it says. And this one was built like ours in Annapolis, yard, because there's 3 different companies that built it, and it was a British design. It's 72. I thought it was 70 foot long. It's 72, and it has speeds up to 42 knots or 50, 60 miles an hour. And it's so compelling was the PT boat's performance, I'm reading it right off, that Nelson Rockefeller converted one into a high-speed yacht for commuting between Albany and New York City. Updated with modern electronics, radar, and 2 turbocharged diesel engines, they replaced the 3 gas engines, providing a 1,100 total horsepower. She is the only PT boat in existence licensed by the U.S. Coast Guard for carrying passengers, and it gives the phone number to call for the boat that they want $1 million for.